Hello again, Adam Elwanger here. Another brief talk about rhetoric and rhetorical theory and criticism. This is for my English 5317 course primarily, but if you can find it useful, that's great. Today we're going to be talking about some excerpts from Gloria Anzaldua's book Borderlands, La Frontera. We're working primarily from two excerpts. One excerpt from an older edition of David Bartholomew's textbook Ways of Reading, and the second excerpt is from the familiar Bizel and Herzberg anthology, The Rhetorical Tradition. So as we bounce back and forth between these two texts, I will reference which excerpt I'm working with. So we should probably begin by picking back up some of the themes that we've been talking about recently in the course. And one of the main features that we've been talking about is ethos, or individual identity, the ways in which it's signified, the ways in which it's recognized, and the ways in which it's authenticated. In other words, how does someone advance an account of themselves in such a way that it's recognized as legitimate by audiences? Obviously, we have to persuade audiences that we are, in fact, who we say we are. And I think that looms large in Anzaldua's text here. Anzaldua's text is a performative one, and what we mean is that she isn't merely talking about identity, that in the process of talking or speaking about identity or writing about identity, she is actually constructing the identity she has in mind. Now, a little bit about Gloria Anzaldua. She wrote a lot. I think this text is from the late 60s or early 70s. She is from the South Texas Valley. She considers herself a mestiza or a Tejana. And much of the text that we're going to be talking about today tries to negotiate or reconcile some of the competing accounts of Hispanic or Latino identities. So, without further ado, I think we should begin by talking about the form of this text, which is very unique. She bounces from topic to topic. She intermingles poetic forms with prose forms. She mixes languages, right? She'll speak in Spanish in one place, and in some places she'll translate that Spanish into English. In other places she'll just offer Spanish and will not offer a translation. In other places she speaks in English but not Spanish. And of course then there's the different dialects of Spanish that she names, and that she'll switch between those also. And so what we end up with is kind of a text that is kaleidoscopic, that has mosaic qualities, where we can really only take in its character from looking at the whole rather than a piece. And on page 1592 and 1593 in the Rhetorical Tradition, she talks a little bit about the process of rhetorical invention as it relates to writing, identity formation, and this text. So I'm going to read a little bit at length here. She says, "In looking at this book that I'm almost finished writing, I see a mosaic pattern, Aztec-like, emerging, a weaving pattern, thin here, thick there. I see a preoccupation with the deep structure, the underlying structure, with the gesso underpainting that is red earth, black earth. I can see the deep structure, the scaffolding. If I can get the bone structure right, then putting flesh on it proceeds without too many hitches. The problem is that the bones often do not exist prior to the flesh, but are shaped after a vague and broad shadow of its form is discerned or uncovered during beginning, middle, and final stages of the writing. Numerous overlays of paint, rough surfaces, smooth surfaces, make me realize I am preoccupied with texture as well. 2, I see the barely contained color threatening to spill over the boundaries of the object it represents. Again, right off the bat, we're talking about boundaries, and the name of the text, of course, is Borderlands, La Frontera. She says, I see a hybridization of metaphor, different species of ideas popping up here, popping up there, full of variations and seeming contradictions. Though I believe in an ordered, structured universe where all phenomena are interrelated and imbued with spirit, this almost finished product seems as an assemblage, a montage, a beaded work with several leitmotifs, and with a central core, now appearing, now disappearing in a crazy dance. Okay, so she comments, this is kind of a meta-commentary on the production of the text. But I think it's important that she describes the production of the text in terms of bodily metaphors, bones, flesh, this kind of thing. If only because of what we said just a moment ago, that the production of the text is on some level a production of the self, right? That she's producing an ethos through the production of this text, and that perhaps the text and the body aren't entirely separable. Or perhaps that borderland between them is blurrier than we might have assumed. And so, we should proceed with a close eye to the stylistic features of this text and how they relate to the thematic claims that get advanced about identity and ethos in the work. So, if we begin with the earlier excerpt from Bartholomew's anthology, this is where Anzaldua sort of begins by talking about her upbringing and about her identity as it took shape through the history of Indian peoples in Mesoamerica in the pre-Columbian era. She begins in the section called Entering Serpent by talking about how she got bitten by a snake in the field. Right, and that night she has these crazy dreams, and because of the venom, right? But it's characterized very much as if one of these Aztec snake gods have possessed her, right? When she got bit by the snake, and that in some ways, what the text that follows here is this text of a shaman, right, who is incensed or occupied by these snake goddesses that she begins to talk about. So she describes 3 phases of Aztec society. One is the pre-centralization period. One is the post-centralization period. And one is the colonial or the post-colonial period. Okay, so when she talks about the pre-centralization, she's talking about the earliest periods of Aztec society, probably prior to the 10th century. When she talks about post-centralization, what she's talking about is after the Aztec tribes that were scattered about Central America had centralized into one place. In other words, she's talking about the period of the Aztec Empire, right? Prior to the arrival of Europeans. And of course, the colonial, post-colonial era is after the arrival of the Spaniards. And she has very different characterizations of these periods. And she reads it through the deities that these people worshipped. And so she begins in the pre-centralization, and of this period she says, one, that the tribal, there were a variety of tribes that made up the Aztec world, right, that they were geographically separated, spread throughout Central America, that they were matrilineal, right, and so they traced their families through the mother side of the family, and finally, or rather not finally, but the deities that they had were these ambiguous deities, right? A deity that was one figure and yet had a dark side and a light side. A side that was associated with fertility, right? And a side that was associated with purity. A side that was associated with peace, and a side that was associated with violence, right? And so Anzaldua is somewhat nostalgic for this period of Aztec culture, in part because these contradictory characteristics could reside in one deity. Okay. Now, as the Aztec civilization grew, right, the Aztec Empire rose, and as that happened, the tribes that had been scattered around, we're talking about the post-centralization period, the tribes that had been scattered around were centralized, right, into cities and into particular parts of Central America. And now what happens here is that we shift from a matrilineal conception of the family and ancestry to a patrilineal one. And so the old, I guess you could call it gynocracy, is displaced by a male order, a male political order. And with that comes increased violence. Anzaldua notes that in the pre-centralization period, the sacrifices to these hybrid complex deities were small animals like birds or small forest animals. She notes that it's the post-centralization period and the transition to a masculine political order that coincides with human sacrifice to the gods. But further, the men, the male-oriented society, splits the old gods, right? So where in the past, in the pre-centralization, we might have one deity that had both dark and light components, both violent and peaceful components, the male-oriented societies of the Aztec Empire split that figure. So now we have two deities, right? And they split off the contradictory characteristics. So this time, this is the dark, violent image of fertility, right? And this other goddess is the light, peaceful image of purity or whatever, right? And so what used to be one deity was split during the post-centralization era into two. And I think that Anzaldua implies strongly that this was because the masculine order saw that this hybridity was a kind of empowerment, that you could be both of these things at once, the virgin and the whore, right? The warrior and the dove, right? Because it allows someone to be a kind of shapeshifter. And in separating these deities, these female deities, right, these contradictory elements, right, they were relieved of some of their power, right, that made them subordinate to the male political order that was necessary for the maintenance of the empire. So the third period is the Colonial Period, right? And of course the Colonial Period begins the eradication of both the pre-centralization and post-centralization concept of Aztec culture, right? And we move, in fact, from at least a polytheistic vision that was present in both of these eras, right, towards a monotheistic one, where there's one deity, right? It's a triune deity, right? But she talks about the Virgin of Guadalupe as the symbol of the integration of these different traditions into a single figure that holds meaning for people of Central America. So this is important, right, because it introduces the theme, and again, for Anzaldua, this is the favorable period, the period that's defined by peace, matrilineal society, decentralized tribal life, small animal sacrifice. She sees this as the ideal. Part of the reason she sees it as the ideal is because both of these apparent contradictions could be tolerated as existing in the same thing. And so, if we go to, page 33, 32, and 33 in the Bartholomew excerpt from the Bartholomew Anthology, we see her celebrate this ambiguity, and she says, she's talking about Guadalupe here. She says, today La Virgen de Guadalupe is the single most potent religious, political, and cultural image of the Chicano Mexicano. She, like my race, is a synthesis of the old world and the new, of the religion and culture of the two races in our psyche, the conquerors and the conquered. She is the symbol of the mestizo true to his or her Indian values. La cultura chicana identifies with the mother, the Indian, rather than with the father, the Spaniard. Our faith is rooted in indigenous attributes, images, symbols, magic, and myth. Because Guadalupe took upon herself the psychological and physical devastation of the conquered and oppressed Indio, she is our spiritual, political, and psychological symbol. As a symbol of hope and faith, she sustains and ensures our survival. The Indian, despite extreme despair, suffering, and near genocide, has survived. To Mexicans on both sides of the border, Guadalupe is the symbol of our rebellion against the rich, upper, and middle class, against their subjugation of the poor and the Indio. Guadalupe unites people of different races, religions, languages, Chicano Protestants, American Indians, and whites. Nuestra abogada siempre serás. Our mediatrix you will always be. She mediates between the Spanish and the Indian cultures, or three cultures, as in the case of Mexicanos of African or other ancestry, and between Chicanos and the white world. She mediates between humans and the divine, between this reality and the reality of spirit entities. La Virgen de Guadalupe is the symbol of ethnic identity and of the tolerance for ambiguity that Chicanos, Mexicanos, people of mixed race, people of Indian blood, people who cross cultures by necessity possess. La gente chicana tiene tres madres. The Chicana people have three moms. All three are mediators. Guadalupe, the Virgin Mother who has not abandoned us. La Chingada, the raped mother whom we've abandoned. And La Llorona, the mother who seeks her lost children and is a combination of the other two. So here we see Anzaldua celebrating the figure of Guadalupe precisely because she is a figure in which ambiguity, contradiction, mediation, and reconciliation can reside, right? She can bridge these gaps between the old and the new and all the things that she named. Okay, so this early segment gets on the table this theme of hybridity, ambiguity, contradiction, and the idea that they can exist in one thing, the hybrid, right? So let's turn now to the segments from the Bazell and Herzberg anthology, and I want to try to graph the contradictions or apparent contradictions of Anzaldua's ethos. So if here we have Gloria Anzaldua, right, we have, two sides to her, right? In the one sense, as she shows throughout the reading, she feels like she has a foot in the English world. After all, she's from Texas, right? And the language, the official language of Texas is English, right? And she knows it, right? It is one of her languages, right? But also opposed to this is Spanish. On the one hand, right, her national identity is American. She's clearly, part of the United States. But in another sense, as she spells out, she's Mexican, and she says she doesn't understand Mexican as a nationality. She understands it in terms of la raza, right? That simply by virtue of her race, she qualifies as a Mexican, or her ethnicity, rather. On this side, right, we have the European culture, and on this side, to a greater extent, we have the Indio, or the Indian culture that she references. In various parts of the book, she mentions the fact that she's a lesbian, right? And so we can graph this dimension of her identity, that the English, American, European gets the heteronormative identity, and the Spanish, Mexican, Indian sides with the queer identity, right? Next, in terms of religious identity, the English, American, European heteronormative is associated with Protestant Christianity, right? And over here, these things are associated with a mix of Catholicism and pagan traditions. And finally, if we were going to talk in terms of gender, I think this side of the equation is gendered masculine, right? This is gendered feminine. And so the way that she sets it up is that, at least in the United States, that this is the privileged side, right? And yet she vocalizes much frustration at both sides of this equation, right? She doesn't see herself as an English-speaking American of European heritage and a Protestant Christianity, this kind of thing, right? But as she stresses again and again, she doesn't fully conceive of herself as Spanish, Mexican, Indian, right? These things. In part because, right, other Chicanos and Chicanas and Mexicans seem to have this this competition over authenticity. And she says that every time she's around Mexican people who are actually from Mexico, right, she feels like her Spanish is viewed as somehow deficient because it's hybridized with English, right? And she says that even sometimes when she's around Hispanics or Latinos from other parts of the United States, other than Texas, that she feels that there's kind of an implicit conflict over language and identity. And so, in short, right, these are the two options laid before her, and each side wants the same thing. What this side says is, identify with us, right? And this is, again, the difference between identity and identification. So identity is oriented towards the self and individual difference. How you take on an identity is you differentiate yourself from the larger group, right? But identification is not an individual phenomenon. Identification is a collective phenomenon. Identification is when you look outside the self at another group and say, yes, I see myself in that. I will identify with that. Okay, so this side of the equation says, please identify with us. Join the group, right? But Anzaldua is smart enough to understand that joining that group has a cost. It has a cost. And what the cost is it means giving up this to a certain extent, right? It means giving up this to a certain extent. It means giving up this to a certain extent. And so, in other words, the people on this side are happy to have her, right? But in order to identify with it, she's got to bring herself into line with this side of the equation, right? And even if she did that, by virtue of the fact that she has this history, she still, even then, could be viewed as something of an outsider within this culture. This side wants the same thing, right? This side says, You should identify with us. This is who you are, right? This is who you are. But they have demands too, right? And what they want to say is, you can't be involved with this, right? You can't be this, these other demands, right? And so each side is trying to pull her onto one side. What space does she occupy? She occupies this middle space, this liminal space, the Borderlands, La Frontera, right? And what she calls this identity is the mestiza. That in between, that space on the border, that is the space of the mestiza. A different identity, right? And yet, an identity that can only be understood as a combination of two things. A mixed identity, right? And we'll get to what her solution is in just a moment. But I want to look at some passages first, right? First, let's look at how language plays into this dynamic. This is on page 1586 in Bazell and Herzberg. She says, Pocho, cultural traitor, you're speaking the oppressor's language by speaking English. You're ruining the Spanish language, they say to her. I've been accused by various Latinos and Latinas. Chicano Spanish is considered by the purists and by most Latinos as a deficient language, a mutilation of Spanish. But Chicano Spanish is a border tongue, which developed naturally. Change, evolución, enriquecimiento de palabras nuevas por invención o adopción, that is, evolution, enrichment of new words for invention or adoption, have created variants of Chicano Spanish, un nuevo lenguaje, right? A new language. And she goes on, un lenguaje que corresponde a un modo de vivir, a language that corresponds with a way of life. It's a big statement. This idea that language corresponds with an ethos. What is an ethos but a habitation, a way of being, right? And she seems to say that language corresponds to a particular way of being, right? And she says her mix of Spanish and English, which exists in the space of the mestiza, correlates with her way of life, right? But that doesn't get the recognition that she seeks, right? She wants recognition of this as a legitimate identity. But this side can only see her new language as basically a deficient form of English, right? This side can only see her hybrid language as a deficient form of Spanish. And so neither side grants it the recognition. Let's continue reading. She says, Chicano Spanish is not incorrect. It is a living language. For people who are neither Spanish, nor live in a country in which Spanish is the first language, for people who live in a country in which English is the reigning tongue, but who are not Anglo, for people who cannot entirely identify with either standard, formal Castilian Spanish, or standard English, what recourse is left to them but to create their own language, a language which they can connect their identity to, one capable of communicating the realities and values true to themselves. A language with terms that are neither Español ni Inglés, but both. We speak a patois, a forked tongue, a variation of two languages. Chicano Spanish sprang out of the Chicanos' need to identify ourselves as a distinct people. We needed a language with which we could communicate with ourselves. A secret language. All right. A few big things there. One, right, is she wants to be identified. She wants not identity. She doesn't want to be separate. She seeks community, right? And yet, what she wants is not community with this and not community with this. What she wants is to take this middle area and take it off the map, right? So that it's its own thing, rather than just a combination of two previously existing worlds. Because as long as that's all it is just a mix of two pre-existing things, then she's saying that it will remain deficient and just kind of a sort of a diluted form of one of these pre-existing identities. All right, so that's the first thing. We see what her aim is now. What she wants to do is legitimize this middle ground as its own thing and as something other than just a mix of two pre-existing sort of superior identities, okay? And so she's seeking recognition, but then she says that she wants to achieve this identification, this taking this category off of the map. She wants to achieve this by coming up with a secret language. And this is something that I think is very important to understand about Anzaldua, all right? Oftentimes when people read this text, they start talking in multiculturalist terms and the terms of sort of liberal tolerance and this kind of thing. But that's really not what's going on here. This is not a plea for inclusion. This is a plea for exclusion, right? She wants to exclude who? The people who aren't in this middle ground. That's who she wants to exclude, right? What is a secret language but a rhetorical attempt to confirm an exclusion, right? Maybe when you were a kid, you had some friends who came up with a secret language, right? And if you did have that experience, you might remember how awful it is to not know it or not be let in, right? Because what the secret language does is allow for exclusion. And that is actually what she's after. And I'll do my best to show that as time proceeds. So if we go to 1588, right, we see what's really at stake here, and it's not kind of a live and let live thing, right? So let's look at page 1588. She says, if a person, Chicana or Latina, has a low estimation of my native tongue, she also has a low estimation of me. Often with Mexicanas and Latinas, we'll speak English as a neutral language. Even among Chicanas, we tend to speak English at parties or conferences. Yet at the same time, we're afraid the other will think we are agringadas because we don't speak Chicano Spanish. We oppress each other, trying to out-Chicano each other, vying to be the real Chicano, right? There is no one Chicano language, just as there is no one Chicano experience. A monolingual Chicano whose first language is English or Spanish is just as much Chicano as one who speaks several variants of Spanish. Okay, jump down about 2 inches. She says, so if you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. And she says, until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. Until I can accept as legitimate Chicano, Texas Spanish, Tex-Mex, and all the other languages I speak, I cannot accept the legitimacy of myself. Until I'm free to write bilingually and to switch codes without having always to translate, while I still have to speak English or Spanish when I would rather speak Spanglish, and as long as I have to accommodate the English speakers rather than having them accommodate me, my tongue will be illegitimate. And what we see here is a couple things. For one, right, her sense of self, her identity is completely dependent on what others think about her language. I'm not sure that you can find actualization in that way because you can't make other people respect that, right? Like, if you respect your language, then you respect yourself, and that's probably about as far as you're going to get. But on the other hand, right, she's not interested in a mutual accommodation where we kind of work together and try to facilitate intercultural communication. What she's interested in is right now she has to accommodate English speakers, right? She wants to flip it. She wants English speakers to have to accommodate her, right? And really, I mean, if we were going to graph that, we think, people read Anzaldua and think, oh, she observes this power binary, right? Where she's down at the bottom, there's this people up top. And all she wants to do is lay it down. So it's egalitarian. No, not really, right? What she really wants to do is take the low and turn it so it's up here, and turn this so it's down here, right? She wants to invert the power game, right? This is strange to me, although it's thoroughly rhetorical, but it's strange to me because usually when people have been in the out group, as she very clearly feels like she has been, she feels like she doesn't have a community. There's a lot of mourning in this text. But usually people who've been a part of the out group are big advocates of making it inclusive, right? To her credit, I think, because she owns it. I'm not saying she's right, but I'm saying that she's quite honest about what the project is. The project is not achieving this. The project is flipping this bar, flipping the power hierarchy. Okay, so let's see. Another passage that I wanted to look at, right? She says, this is on 1590, she says, Nosotros los Chicanos straddle the borderlands. They straddle the borderlands. On one side of us, we're constantly exposed to the Spanish of the Mexicans. On the other side, we hear the Anglos' incessant clamoring so that we forget our language. Okay, I'm going to jump over a little bit. She says, Chicanos and other people of color suffer economically for not acculturating. This voluntary yet forced alienation makes for psychological conflict, a kind of dual identity. We don't identify with the Anglo-American cultural values, and we don't totally identify with the Mexican cultural values. We are a synergy of two cultures with various degrees of Mexicanness and Anglo-ness. I have so internalized the borderland conflict that sometimes I feel like one cancels out the other, and we are zero, nothing, no one. Okay, so she feels like because it's got to be this or this or this, and she is both this and this, they cancel each other out, and there's no room for that middle ground, that different identity that we can lift off of the grid. Okay, and yet now we're starting to see that theme of the hybrid, the ambiguity, the mediatrix return, because she says that what we are is a synergy, right? So let's look at a couple places that deal with that hybridity. If we go to 1592, right, she talks about it explicitly. She says that she sees a hybridization of metaphor, right? We looked at that passage already. And on 1597, and she says, here you go. This is the first column, 1597. She says, opposite to the theory of the pure Aryan and to the policy of racial purity that white America practices, his theory is one of inclusivity. At the confluence of two or more genetic streams, with chromosomes constantly crossing over the border, right? This mixture of races, rather than being an inferior being, provides hybrid progeny, a mutable, more malleable species with a rich gene pool. Okay, oddly, and this is a weird statement here, right? First off, she hits Western culture for being all about no ambiguity, no hybridity, right? That it's about purity, which was certainly true to a greater extent when she wrote this. I think arguably, though, we've entered a period of American culture where hybridity really is favored. I mean, it was this emphasis on hybridity that undergirded Barack Obama's entire 2008 campaign, right? Almost every speech of his began with, I'm the son of a black man from Kenya and a white woman from Kansas, right? And what we saw in the figure of Barack Obama, or what we were supposed to see, was the simultaneous inhabitation of these apparently contradictory experiences. And because they were unified in the figure of Barack Obama, we assumed that he had the capacity to heal these fissures in American culture between the African American experience and the Caucasian European experience. Whether or not you think he did that, I'll leave up to you, right? But it's clear that the hybridity of the president, or of the candidate at that point, right, was one of the big selling points. And I think that that remains the case. You can look at the conversations regarding the 2020 Democratic nominee coming up in the American presidential election and see some of the same themes. But anyways, what's interesting here is that rather than say, look, like there's the doctrine of purity and the doctrine of hybridity, she seems to elevate the hybrid not merely as a difference, but as a superiority, right? That through the mixing of these genetic histories, we come out with a being that is genetically superior. And to me, that's a little troubling. But, you know, like I could see historically the perspective that she's working from. Nevertheless, we see now why she had this nostalgia for the pre-centralization period of Aztec culture, when these contradictory elements could reside in one entity, where you could structure an ethos or an identity that is both and, rather than either or. All right, and she sees the possibility for this ethos, this hybrid ethos. She says on page 1591, yet the struggle of identities continues. The struggle of borders is our reality still. One day, the inner struggle will cease, and a true integration will take place. In other words, this space becomes its own thing because these are truly integrated rather than being binarily opposed. All right, she says, in the meantime, until the integration happens, tenemos que hacer la lucha. ¿Quién está protegiendo los ranchos de mi gente? ¿Quién está tratando de cerrar la fisura entre la India y el blanco en nuestra sangre? El chicano, sí, el chicano que anda como un ladrón en su propia casa. All right, says, who will protect the ranches of my people? Who will heal the gap between the Indian and the white in our blood? She says, the Chicano, yes, the Chicano who's a thief in his own house. She continues. We'll skip that passage for now, right? But she's talking about this integration that makes possible the hybrid category of the mestiza as its own category, not one that is a subsidiary of other larger categories. Okay. Let's see. Finally, 1597, she talks about the limits of aligning yourself either with this side or that side. That seems to be something she's unwilling to do. She's unwilling to say, all right, I'll be on this side, right? Or, all right, I'll be on this side. And that's part of the reason that she's very lonely and without community, because what identification means, to some extent, is dissolving the particularities of the self in favor of aligning yourself with certain commonly shared characteristics. She seems to want, to belong to a very narrow community to the exclusion of others. But either way, she sees this choice as untenable, and here's why. She says, but it's not enough to stand on the opposite riverbank, whichever side of the river you're on. It's not enough to stand on the opposite side, shouting questions, challenging patriarchal white conventions. A counterstance locks one into a duel of oppressor and oppressed, locked in mortal combat like the cop and the criminal. Both are reduced to a common denominator of violence. The counterstance refutes the dominant culture's views and beliefs, and for that, it's proudly defiant. All reaction is limited by and dependent on what it is reacting against. Because the counterstance stems from a problem with authority, outer authority as well as inner authority, it's a step towards liberation from cultural domination, but it's not a way of life. At some point, on our way to a new consciousness, we'll have to leave the opposite bank. The split between the two mortal combatants somehow healed, until we are on both shores at once, and at once, perhaps, see through serpent and eagle eyes. We will decide to disengage from the dominant culture, write it off altogether as a lost cause, and cross the border into a wholly new and separate territory. Okay, there's the plan. Okay, so fascinating text. One that gives us much to talk about in terms of identity, cultural politics, inclusion, exclusion, authenticity, recognition, ethos, text, textuality, these kinds of things. I will leave those up to you. If you have questions, put them in the comments. Thanks, as always, for watching. I hope you have a good night.